Welcome, everybody, to our customer exclusive webinar, Good Fences Make Good Neighbors, Managing Third-Party Risk. Today, Reg is going to bring you through really kind of what those risks are and how to mitigate them. And again, as a customer, you may have spoken about this, but we want to delve a little deeper. Reg, next slide. Thank you. So for our upcoming webinar, we do have a quick, if you can do a show of hands or in the chat, we are trying to decide if we should do a July webinar for you. We do them every other month. I know July gets really busy for people. And so I'm not sure if that's something you are interested in. We would love to do one if you thought that that's good timing. I see a thumbs up. Any other thumbs up? All right, well, please let us know. You can always add it to chat as we go. And depending on how many people are interested, we will make sure that we do that. And then we do have one in September when everybody's back in and less focused on summer, Cybercrime Survival Guide, 7 tips for effective incident response. And with that, I'm going to introduce our our speaker for today. I believe everybody knows him. If not, this is Reg Harnish, our CEO at OrbitalFire. Reg, you want to take it from there?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, everyone. Good morning. We're going to start with a few quick questions here. Third-party risk is something that we've been talking about more recently over probably the last year or so, so much so that we actually introduced a new service January 1st of this year. But curious of the people who are here today, what your experience with or your knowledge of third-party risk currently is. So first question here, how many foreign entities, how many organizations, third parties have access to or take custody of protected assets? And that would mean your data, perhaps they have access to your network, give people a chance to answer here. Okay, kind of probably roughly what we expected. So small businesses generally don't have, real deep supply chains. And so it's usually a couple of third-party or supply chain entities. But yeah, we expected that there'd be some who just don't know. And that's hopefully why you're here today. So we can share those results and we'll talk about the next question here. So of those third parties that do introduce some kind of residual risk, do you know which of those are classified or introduce the greatest risk to your organization today? Give you guys a minute to respond here. But generally, this classification process is just as important as understanding who may be in your inventory. I'm going to talk about each one of these concepts here. But okay, so it looks like the vast majority of folks really don't know who introduces the greatest risk. And so happy to see that in some ways, because I think we're going to cover a lot of this here today. So let's get through an introduction to third-party risk management. In some ways, anyone who has gone through or is currently undergoing annual risk assessments, compliance assessments with us today, you have some sense of what does the risk management process actually look like. And for your third parties, there's going to be some overlap. Some of those components actually will get reused or reiterated in the third-party risk management. It's just that our process for risk treatment or mitigation, those options are significantly different. And so we're going to talk about that as well as the process and some other things that we think are really important here. But let me take everyone back to, I think this was 2014. Everyone was around when the massive Target breach became international, I'll say interplanetary news, and it was just everywhere for months. And in many ways, the real story was covered up by the media because Target's response to their incident at that time was not necessarily effective, right? We're going back 10 years where cybersecurity, incident response. These were things that were not household words at the time. Even big business, big enterprises who were investing in cybersecurity for sure at that time probably didn't have the level of maturity that we do or they do today. And so what happened was the story focused on the changing reports out of Target. Was it 30 million cards? Was it 70? Was it 120? Was it just red card holders? Was it Target really didn't know for a long time. But the story that never really broke, that was critically important, is that the Target breach was affected by a 40-person HVAC company in the plains of the United States. So Fazio Mechanical, again, very small HVAC contractor, had access to or was providing HVAC support to probably a dozen locations, Target locations at that time in sort of the Midwest. And they had access to Target networks. Now, certainly Target has accountability here. They didn't segregate access control. We could go on and on, some of the failures that occurred at Target. But patient zero, the root cause, the first compromise was this tiny organization. And so the third-party risk element really never came to the surface, or it didn't come to the surface for many years. But we can go on and on. Sony, Home Depot, I mean, there are just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these well-known, highly visible cybersecurity related incidents where supply chain risk was really the culprit, or certainly partly the root cause of these issues. Fast forward to today, businesses are continuing to outsource, leverage the cloud, third parties, software as a service. And so third-party risk has just grown, or the importance of third-party risk management has grown incalculably, because we just have no idea in most cases who's connected, who takes custody. Certainly when we talk about this cascading effect of third-party risk, it's a difficult concept, especially if we're not even managing risk internally, if we're not doing regular assessments and risk management. So let's start with the definition. Third-party risk is the process of assessing, right, monitoring, and definitions here, but for me, it's about assessing, first of all, understanding who your third parties are, assessing the risks that they introduce, monitoring for changes, and then treating those risks in a way that makes sense in your overall risk strategy. And these risks can come from any third party. And whether it's a vendor providing IT services, or it's a supplier of internet, software developers from another country, it could be anything. If a third party, a separate legal entity, has access to or takes custody of your protected assets, and I'll talk about what those are, then there is a chance that they are introducing risk that you should be aware of. So what does this look like today? So here's you, right? Most of you are leveraging some major cloud provider, Microsoft, Google, Salesforce.com, things like that. You probably are outsourcing your payroll to a third party, right? So sensitive information there. They are taking custody of really important data. You've handed the keys to your kingdom to an IT provider or managed services provider, and probably have never done a risk assessment on them, yet they have literally the highest level of admin access to every one of your assets. Many of you are developing software, and some of that software development occurs offshore or either domestically, but certainly from a third party. Again, things like Dropbox, QuickBooks, most of your data lives in third-party clouds somewhere along the way. And even in the operational side of the business, you may be sharing information intentionally with an organization like a marketing agency, and perhaps they're running campaigns or social media ads. And then, of course, the list goes on and on. What about your janitorial service? Now, we could fill this entire slide with bubbles, but what is important here is that you recognize that your risk is now this, right? You assume much of this risk from these third parties. And in many cases, your cybersecurity program is inherited significantly from third parties as well. And anyone, again, who's been through an assessment with us knows that we are combing through your third-party SOC 2 reports, ISO 27K certifications, other security attestations, or any other public information to understand, well, what does Microsoft do about encrypting non-public information, or EPHI? All of that becomes inheritable from, is that a word? Inheritable? Inheritable? It's one of those. You inherit those controls, and that's part of your cybersecurity program for a third party. So it's important that we understand what it is and how we're going to treat it if it doesn't meet our expectations. Now, also keep in mind that this is cascading. And so we talk about inbound and outbound third-party risk management. You are inheriting risk from your suppliers, your vendors, contractors, cloud providers, things like that. But subsequently, your customers and downstream supply chain entities, they're inheriting risk from you. So no surprise that most of you, if not all, are inundated or at least being scrutinized by third parties on a regular basis, right? You get questionnaires. Maybe there's some due diligence in the contract process for your customers. We know because we've sat through many of these conversations and helped some of you through them, right? We're your chief information security officer, so not uncommon for us to sit on a sales or business development call talking about your cybersecurity program, because it is being scrutinized more frequently and more intensely. But there's this sliding chain here of where risk lives. And we're going to talk about more complex concepts, but risk flows throughout the supply chain. And so we, as good supply chain citizens and stewards of protected assets, we need to understand how we are receiving risk from others and what risk we are essentially exuding to our outbound or inbound third parties. What are the benefits of this process? So defensibility is something that we encourage all of our customers to really think about, right? Are we doing enough of the right things in the right order so that if there ever is scrutiny, and whether you're applying for cyber insurance or you're responding to a questionnaire from your best customer, right? We want to be in a defensible position. We want to be doing the right things or enough of the right things so that when we're asked, that our program is adequate or appropriate and reasonable, or we can defend it. We're in a defensible position. Sometimes peace of mind. Again, there were a lot of don't knows in the poll questions this morning. Some of you may be concerned about this, but maybe weren't really sure how to address your growing supply chain and your growing need to outsource or leverage the cloud, or leverage applications that are hosted by third parties. Operational inconsistencies. We're going to talk a little bit about the elements that go beyond cybersecurity, because those are important. And again, we are not attorneys, but we have seen enough contracts to know what makes sense and what you should be aware of. And then, of course, for those of you who are primarily here because you're getting questionnaires, we want to produce better outcomes for your customers. Better outcomes produce happier customers stay longer and pay more. And so this really becomes a strategic asset. Your cybersecurity program and the way you're managing third-party risk can be an asset to your business, a competitive advantage, a cost reduction. And we should be thinking about cybersecurity that way. Also, it's required. Let's not forget that. So most of you, and I haven't seen the latest attendee list, but most of you will probably fall under one or more of these mandates. Keep in mind that New York State DFS, CMMC, healthcare, manufacturing, virtually every market segment that we operate in has some requirement to manage risk. Some go much more deeply. So DFS, the SEC, they are heavily focused on third-party risk. Healthcare is another great example. There's an entire cottage industry and a definition of this idea of a business associate. A third party that is treated as a covered entity now, given the HITECH Act. So in healthcare, it's become very intense, and it has been for a decade or so. So with high tech, it meant that anyone you considered a business associate is now also subject to the same compliance requirements that a hospital would be. So cascading, managing risk, all of that stuff has been around in healthcare for many years. And then we're seeing it in other places as well. Again, for small businesses, it's important because unlike an enterprise who may not be in the middle of that cascade, you're really in the middle. So you're consuming and you're producing, and it's so you have risk in both directions to be concerned about. All right, let's go through a few of the basics, and then I'm going to talk about a couple of advanced elements, and then we want to make sure that you guys have time for questions. So let's start really right here. For us, we know that nothing's going to get done unless someone is accountable for it. Now, for many of you, being your chief information security officer or your virtual CISO, we are responsible for this process. And many of you have engaged us for our third-party risk management service. However, accountability cannot be outsourced. So another good example would be, let's say you're putting a bunch of your protected data in Dropbox or Google Drive. If Google Drive is compromised and your data is lost and subsequently stolen and then sold on the dark web, your customers do not care that you're in Google. And whether or not your customers sue Google is almost irrelevant because they will hold you accountable for this. The data was in your custody. The fact that you were using Google Drive or a hamster wheel didn't matter to them. So really important that all of you recognize that accountability cannot be outsourced. And what we're seeing in most of the regulatory mandates is an increasing intensity on accountability and pushing that up to the most senior people in the organization. And typically that's like a CEO, a fiduciary, an owner of the business, your board. So when you attest to your New York State DFS compliance, for example, that has to be done by the most senior person in the organization who is at that time attesting for accountability to your third-party risk management program. So accountability, really important. Make sure someone in your organization is on the hook for managing this if you're going to be successful. We'll do all the work for you, but someone in your organization needs to be accountable. One of the first steps we want to get through is this idea or the concept of an inventory. So a list, it can be a very simple spreadsheet. Again, we can help you with all of these elements. We have templates. We know what to look for. But a simple list of your third parties, and typically this would be what I'll call outbound third parties, meaning the third parties where you are interested in assessing and managing their risk because it has impact on your operations or your aggregate risk. Your customers and others who are sending you questionnaires, you can include them in your inventory, but generally speaking, we're not managing their risk. They're managing yours in some ways. So this is about outbound third-party risk management. What should go in your inventory? A classification. So do they have access to your protected assets? Those 5 protected assets include your money. So if you have a wealth manager or someone is managing investments for the company and they have access to your financial accounts, money's number 1. Number 2, regulated data. That would be EPHI, PII, PCI, CUI, all the I's. So if you have a third party who is managing or has access to or takes custody of that information, they're going to be a higher classification. The third is intellectual property. If you're in manufacturing, you're probably building something. And those trade secrets are things that you don't want to leak out. However, if you subcontract the ball bearings to your assembly out to a third party, well, you better understand their cybersecurity program. So intellectual property is important. Number 4 is any type of elevated privilege. So an admin account. This is really where your IT firm comes in because they have, generally speaking, unfettered access to every computer, network device, every piece of data in your digital estate. So in most cases, your MSP is going to be one of your highest classified third parties because they have access to everything. Not only do they have access to everything, but they can make changes to your environment. They can do things likely without your knowledge. So MSPs have a special place here for us. And then number 5 is reputational assets, which most of you, we are not so concerned. But if there's anything secret or maybe sketchy or salacious going on at the organization that you don't want out, or it could be news of a potential acquisition that you might be making, things like that. We want to make sure that those 5 assets are what we're protecting with your cybersecurity program. Any third party that has access to or takes custody of those assets should be of the highest classification. Next, I talked about the difference between taking custody of and just having access. Those two things have introduced different risks. So for example, your marketing agency who might be doing email campaigning for you, you may be sending them a list of PII. They may not have access to your environment. You just send them, hopefully through some encrypted means or some protected message. They take the data, they use it, and then they produce results for you. So that's what we call taking custody of the data, meaning they've actually taken it into their environment. Access might be, again, like your MSP. Your MSP may not take custody of any of your assets, but they have access to everything. When someone has access to your environment, typically they become a weak link in a different way. So like Target, right? That HVAC vendor had access to Target assets. They did not take custody of information. Risk score. So every third party that introduces risks should have a score. And that might be high, medium, low if you're just kind of going at this in a general way. Or if you're really subject to very specific risks from your supply chain, we may get more quantified. So an 85 or a 50, things like that. That's something that we can help you figure out. But every one of your third parties that introduces risks should have some kind of score. And in addition to that, there should be some low watermark, some threshold where under which a third party should be scrutinized or considered for replacement or just not working with them. So if this is the due diligence process. So if they don't meet some basic expectations around cybersecurity, it should trigger some kind of evaluation where you say, is it worth working with this organization given their risk? And then of course the contracts. Keep in mind that your treatment of risk in a third party goes from under your control to a contract. And so it's a very different method for enforcing, first of all, communicating, but then enforcing your cybersecurity program. So for example, a very common one is the right to audit. Another one might be disclosure notifications. So if your marketing firm took that PII, used it, and then they were compromised and that information was stolen, well, in your contracts, there should be some language around a requirement for them to notify you that that happened. It's becoming very common. You've all seen them yourselves, right, during the due diligence process for your customers. And so there are roughly 6 things that we like to see in contracts. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But of course, if you have any questions, just please let us know and we'll get you some template language. Okay, let's talk about the assessment. So anyone who's been through an assessment with us, the assessment with your third parties can be almost identical. Now, of course, we don't have access, visibility, authority, or governance over those controls. And so oftentimes we are subject to a process where we have to trust what they have told us, or we're even farther removed from that information. So if they just send us a SOC 2 report or an ISO 27K certification or any other cybersecurity language, we're going to have to trust in some ways what's in that document. Now, generally speaking, we don't see organizations lying, but it may be inaccurate. That's possible, a mistake, an oversight, things like that. But we want to make sure that with your third parties, we're looking at the same things that we look at internally, right? So people, process, technology, you can think of it depending on the framework that you've adopted. There could be 5 categories, there could be 15 categories. But we want to make sure that we've covered all that ground, right? So from access control to, are they training and educating their workforce? Do they have physical security controls? Are they assessing their own risk, right? And so all of the things that you are subject to are things that we should consider assessing in our third parties. One of the things that we'll help you come up with is a standard assessment template, which requires some thinking. We want to adopt the right framework, the right questions, and a process for distributing those questionnaires to your third parties and getting those risk scores and figuring out what are we going to do about this, right? Is it a high score? Is it a low score? And what's the process for dealing with that? In your contracts, there's about 6 things or CISO, and we'll help you, we'll work with you on that. Here are a few of the things that we want to see, though. Contracts. What are your expectations from a cybersecurity standpoint? Some of them may be specifically compliance. So if you are, two of the industries that really have started enforcing third-party risk is healthcare and manufacturing, especially if you're in the DoD supply chain. So if you're a manufacturer and you're subcontracting a circuit or an antenna or a ball bearing, you want to have in your contracts the same language that's in your contracts from your primes, which is you need to be compliant with CMMC, or in healthcare, you need to be compliant with the HIPAA security rule, high tech, and all of the guidance from HHS. That kind of compliance is a good backstop because it absolves you of the need to educate your customer on what it is, right? The HIPAA security rule has been around since 2003, and certainly while CMMC and DFARS is a bouncing ball, your manufacturing subcontractors, they have probably heard of this and know where to find information on it. So the requirements, expectations, and generally the core of that might be compliance with some industry framework or mandate. The next is a right to audit. Now, in most cases, you're not going to exercise this, right? You don't have the time, money, and energy to go auditing your third parties. Certainly not all of them on an annual basis. But what we'll do is we'll say, listen, based on the classification of this third party and their aggregate risk score, which might be very low, we might say, hey, listen, this is not a good situation for us. Let's on every other year, we're gonna send someone in for a couple of hours to assess. That right to audit clause in your contracts gives you the ability, essentially the easement, so to speak, to go and perform that activity. And they've agreed to it, right, as part of your contract. And then, of course, something that has really become very, very common is this requirement to be notified if your data or your assets have been compromised or impacted in any way. So if you're in real estate or financial services, the term is material impact. So in your contract, you want to make sure that any third party who introduces material impact to your organization, so that could be data exposure, that could be operational disruption, that could be a lot of other things. If there's a material impact to your organization, you want to be notified within a certain time frame. The time frame can be a little bit tricky, and we can help you kind of work through that. The shorter you make that time frame, the more likely it will be that the information you get is inaccurate or yeah, I mean, some people are going to hedge their bets if it's early in an incident response scenario. So we'll help you think through that. But generally speaking, you want to look at somewhere between, once an incident has been declared, you need to be notified within, like, let's say 24 hours, 72 hours, something like that. In some cases, it's 30 days. Some of this is going to depend on the classification of that third party and the work that they're doing for you. But your contracts, that's how you're going to enforce your expectations from your third parties. Monitoring. So this doesn't mean monitoring like intrusion and threat detection, things like that. This is actually more monitoring the risk status of those third parties. Typically, this is an annual reevaluation. It could be done through a questionnaire, an outbound questionnaire that you're sending to your third parties, their self-assessment and risk scoring, and then your evaluation of that score. But it also may result in things like updating your contracts. Maybe you're changing the language to make it more stringent, or you're changing the notification deadline, things like that. Obviously, every one of you, every industry over the last 2 years, we did a webinar on this January, almost every industry has experienced either some or significant regulatory update. And so as these things are changing, the expectations of you are going to drive new expectations from your third party. And then also, of course, we continue to see impactful incidents in supply chains everywhere. Healthcare is dealing with 5 massive compromise, incidents right now that is having impact on some of our customers. And we've had them contact us and say, hey, listen, heads up, not for nothing, but the Change Healthcare thing is affecting our AP, our accounts receivable. So this is things that happen. Again, be thinking about material impact and what that means to you, whether it's operational disruption, payroll and cash, or other cyber-related elements as well. We want to be monitoring these third parties and, again, continuously assessing the risk that they introduce to our organization. Mitigation, a lot of that will be done in your contract. So now, if you discover through an audit, or let's say, it could happen in a lot of ways, but let's say you discover that one of your third parties who said yes to multi-factor or encrypting your data that they've taken custody of, they're actually not doing that. Okay, so now what? What do we do about that? Well, one, obviously, we're going to revisit that contract, and there's some communication that needs to happen with that third party. But on the mitigation side, are there ways that we can treat that risk that don't involve demanding the third party to do something themselves? Well, there are certainly cases where maybe we weren't sending encrypted data because we were told that the data was encrypted end to end. But maybe now we say, listen, the data doesn't leave our organization unless it's encrypted by us, right? So we have essentially what's called compensated for a third-party deficiency in a way that mitigates some of that risk. There are other cases as well, some of which will result in contractual violations, which that's a legal issue, and so outside the scope of this conversation, but certainly there are ways for us to treat risk in a third party on occasion. So just because you have a third party that introduces unacceptable risk does not necessarily mean that you can't work with that, right? There may be ways for us to compensate or mitigate those risks without their involvement. Basically, we're going to force them to do things a different way. But we see this all the time where a manufacturer says, I can't get this component anywhere else at this price. I have to work with them. So we say, okay, let's talk about the process of the data. What can we do ourselves to ensure that we're minimizing this risk? Obviously, non-compliance is an issue. So if there are enforcement actions from your industry, like your regulatory authority on one of your third parties, big or small, that becomes an issue because, again, you're inheriting that non-compliance from that third party. And so if we believed that they were encrypting EPHI at rest, and then there was a desk side audit and it was discovered that indeed that they were not, that becomes a non-compliance issue for you as well. And so one of the things we want to make sure, again, going back to defensibility, is that one, we're aware of this non-compliance issue, but also that we have reacted to it. And so, again, part of a good monitoring and mitigation component for your third-party risk is saying, hey, listen, we were just notified of this issue. Here's how we're responding. Here are the things that we're going to do to treat this risk or compensate for this deficiency, things like that. And then, of course, at some point, you may have to make the hard decision that a third party introduces unacceptable risk. There's no mitigation possible. There's no compensation available. And essentially, we need to look for an alternative. And that does happen. We try to minimize those things. Obviously, you're working with that third party for good reasons. And so we don't want cybersecurity to be a hurdle or a challenge in that process. But there are cases where it happens. And so in that case, we want to have a conversation. All right, let's talk about some advanced topics here. Things that we don't see that often, but you should be aware of just in terms of understanding, comprehension, the issues that we're dealing with and how we treat this risk in the process. I talk a little bit about the different types of risk: access versus custody, and that each one of these should and will introduce different risks to you. We're going to bake that into your risk scoring. It's going to be identified in your inventory. And what we'll do is identify common practices for treating access risk versus custody risk. So for example, going back to the marketing firm that's doing email campaigning for you, we may just say in policy that PII that leaves the organization, no matter who it's going to, has to be encrypted. And has to have, here's our password policy for that data. And maybe there's a data retention requirement. And there could be lots of other things. But what we want to do is come up with accepted standards for treating access risk versus custody risks. And then that also sort of helps us decide for, we have the option of access versus custody. Is there one that we prefer because we're better at treating those risks? We want to make sure that we distinguish between these two different risk categories because they can be very different, and it will affect your risk scoring at times. I mentioned a few certifications that are and have become very common, and we're actually seeing more of our small business customers commit to these processes as well. The SOC audit and observation has become very common. The ISO 27000 is less common, but certainly it's out there, and we have customers who are pursuing this or considering pursuing this. And really the advantage for you going through this is, generally speaking, if a customer asks you about your cybersecurity program, or they send you this 300 question questionnaire, oftentimes you can completely ignore that questionnaire, send them your SOC 2 certification, and satisfy that requirement. So there's good and there's bad here. The good is that you are, by adopting and going through these and maintaining these certifications, it's a clear commitment to cybersecurity and managing risk internally. The bad thing is that no one really knows what the SOC 2 is or the 27K. They've become more common, but in many cases they're just checkboxes. And so we have seen many of our customers undergo this kind of scrutiny, and we send the questions back, and the third party who asked us the questions doesn't understand the questions themselves. We answer the questions to the best of our ability, send that questionnaire back. This third party also doesn't understand our answers, and that's largely because this process is being enforced, but the quality of the process is still not there today. Now, we want to avoid that, of course, right? We want to, in a very simple way, understand and help you understand what risk are you inheriting from these third parties. So if we say, here's a questionnaire on an annual basis, and that third party just sends you their SOC 2 report, we have some decisions to make. We can say, one, it's not worth going through all of this. If they've done the SOC 2 or the 27K or high trust or any other cert out there, are we comfortable accepting this in lieu of our questionnaire? In some cases, we may say yes. It really depends on, again, going back to that inventory, what's the classification, what's their current risk score, is it access or custody? We'll have an intelligent conversation about that. But in some cases, we may say, listen, thank you for the SOC 2 report, but we still need you to figure out how to answer this questionnaire. They're becoming prevalent, and we're seeing it kind of surprisingly so in small businesses, and the number of customers of ours who say, hey, listen, I'm being forced to do this SOC 2 thing. Can you help us get ready? And of course, we will do that. That is part of our offering. But there's there's an advantage and a disadvantage to this. And many of you who are doing annual assessments with us, we are collecting those on your behalf. We're reviewing those SOC 2 reports and the other attestations. So those are automatically getting baked into your overall aggregate risk picture, because that's part of our assessment process. But I would say plan on more of this. It's just continuing to grow. Okay, we're talking about third party, but there is such a thing as fourth party. And unfortunately, at some point, because risk cascades up and down the supply chain, at some point, I don't know, 2 years from now, we're going to be doing this webinar about fourth party risk. I would say it's less of an issue today because the process itself isn't all that mature, and we don't see, and not all of our customers have a robust, mature third party risk management process. They just don't. But you should be aware that, again, this cascading of risk is something that we are keeping our eye on, and we should be thinking about this in certain circumstances. Today, probably not that prevalent, but it's out there and it's coming. I mentioned that there are non-cyber security factors to consider here. So is a business profitable? Right? Is one of your third parties, are they viable businesses? Are they in a viable market? Have they had, headlines about layoffs, things like that? Reputational issues, right? That could be a concern as well. So if it turns out one of your primary third parties turns out to be a seedy organization, is that enough of a risk, a reputational risk for you to consider going elsewhere? Or performance, right? Over time, are they doing the job that they said they would? So if it's a software development company and they continue to produce code late, defective, buggy, whatever, that's also a risk to your business. And so you should be considering all of these other risks as well. And so third-party risk, we're talking about the cyber component, but certainly encourage you to think about this process as a larger function. Okay, a couple of final thoughts. We'll take questions and then we'll let you guys go. So keep in mind that, good fences make good neighbors, but you're one of those neighbors. And don't be surprised. So our customers are pretty much absolved of this, I would hope. But generally speaking, if you have a robust third-party risk management process, but you're not doing your own work, guess what? You're going to end up on the other side of this coin, which is you're going to get canceled. Your customers are going to stop buying from you, right? You're not getting cyber insurance. You're not. So there are reasons to be a good neighbor as well. Now, I would say this is not really necessarily a primary driver of your cybersecurity program, but it's an important one for sure. And honestly, if I look at the 3 reasons, maybe the 4 reasons that small businesses come to us to engage, one of them is absolutely, I'm getting these questionnaires, or I'm being forced to do a SOC 2, or I can't get cyber insurance because I can't pass this basic application. Those third-party mandates and requirements are driving small businesses to build a cybersecurity program. I wouldn't say it's the best reason to do it, but it is a reason, and that's the reality. So keep in mind that you are a neighbor, you're on one side of that fence. And so just as we're encouraging you to start thinking more about aggregate risk, third parties, your third parties are doing the exact same thing right now. And so we should be prepared to, and again, you're all customers, so we should be prepared and having conversations about how are you handling this? What's the plan? Is the scrutiny intensifying, growing? What are you hearing? So let's make that a conversation over in your next OCR meeting with us. We really want to understand where you are and what your concerns are. One of the things that we encourage you to think about is this idea of a due diligence binder. Most of you are not doing SOC 2s, and you're almost definitely not doing 27K certs. So in lieu of that, there are ways we can bundle your policy, your incident response plan, probably your written information security plan, your PCI compliance attestation, or your pen testing attestations. Put these all in one place. So when you get a questionnaire, hopefully we can avoid answering that thing at all. All we do is we send back that due diligence binder and say, we've built a cybersecurity program, right? There's a general statement that says we've adopted the NIST 171 or the HIPAA security rule. We undergo, annual assessments, risk assessments from experienced, expert, independent cybersecurity experts, blah, blah, blah. And here's all of our artifacts that you're probably going to ask for anyway. Oftentimes, again, because this process is actually rather immature worldwide, is they're going to be blown away by your organization, and they're going to see all this stuff, and they may come back and say, listen, appreciate all of this, but I still need you to respond to the questionnaire. That happens, but in many cases they say, thank you for this. This covers everything we need. We're good to go. And so let's talk about the due diligence binder as well. Most of you, again, I'm not sure who's here today, but most of you have developed or are in the process of developing these important artifacts that we can bind up and use as your first response, your first response to any kind of scrutiny, any kind of third-party questionnaire. Neighbors, we all deal with this, right? We are in the same boat, of course. Microsoft, Amazon, they're not going to fill out your questionnaire, even though you are inheriting risks from these players. So there is a percentage of your outbound or your third parties where you are inheriting risk, but generally we're going to have to trust the information that they're providing. Microsoft is a really great example. Luckily, most of them are responsible enough to make this information publicly available on their website or by a simple request if we're looking for their SOC 2, things like that. And so we really haven't run into too many issues with the big cloud players like Google and such, because they make that information available. Generally, they're doing the right things. However, keep in mind that doesn't mean that this stuff works all the time. There's a lot of misperception about Microsoft's cybersecurity program or Google's, and everyone thinks that the biggest cloud providers on the planet, they must be doing all of these things in cybersecurity. And I would argue that in most cases, they probably are. We've never verified that, of course. But even if they are, that stuff isn't fail-proof, right? So keep that in mind. Just the way stuff breaks in your organization or doesn't protect you the way you thought it would, Microsoft has the same exact issues. So just because you're leveraging Microsoft, an encrypted Office 365 tenancy for medical records, doesn't mean it's not going to be compromised. Keep in mind, you cannot outsource that accountability. You can sue Microsoft if you want, good luck, but your customers do not care, and they're going to hold you accountable for these things. So what that means is, for big neighbors, we need to continue to incorporate that information that they're willing to share into your annual compliance and risk assessments. Most of them have adopted consistent incident notification and other things, but there's no such thing as a right to audit with these folks. We just live with this because that's the nature of the business. Last topic here, just like you've onboarded third parties, and hopefully you did some due diligence, and hopefully going forward, you're doing something more precise on the cybersecurity side, there's also an offboarding. At some point, you either consider them unacceptable or they haven't performed to a level, or you just found a better option. Let's make sure as part of your third-party risk management function that we've thought about how do we terminate custody or access to our assets with a third party. And in some ways, it's similar to, or will be similar to, how you offboard an employee that has elevated access to certain things. But we still want to make sure that we've got a checklist and that we're going through that, and that it's an auditable process. We can go back 2 years ago to say, yeah, we offboarded, XYZ provider, whether it was your IT provider or someone making ball bearings, and here are the steps that we went through. Again, going back to defensibility, we want to make sure we have that documentation and a process that we can follow that has a lot of these considerations in there. Okay, last thing, you're already our customers. We're not selling here, but if you're interested in talking more about third-party risk in our services and how we can help, please let us know. Just mention it to your customer success specialist, email me, your vCISO, support@orbitalfire.com. Any of those channels will get you a conversation whenever you're available. Talk a little bit more about specifically how it relates to your business and how it might work. And of course, we'll always do our best to answer your questions. Speaking of, would love to take any questions that you have. Not going to put you on the spot. Contact your customer success specialist in your next OCR. Let's talk about this. And if anything else comes up, please just let us know in the meantime. Back to you, Dana.
Great, Reg, thank you so much. And it looks like you answered everybody's questions, or they're going to wait to reach out to us
Just so
directly.
good.
You are, see, and very modest. So, but thank you, everybody, for joining. As Reg said, there's lots of ways to get in touch with us. We'll always respond quickly. We really value your business, and we look forward to seeing you at our next one. Great. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Bye-bye.